Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hi, Mouin. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Nassim. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. So this week on the show, we'll be beginning with the Israeli strike on a Tabi'in school in Gaza City, which killed over 100 Palestinians. The genocidal comment by Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich on wanting to starve 2 million plus Palestinians. And there was the video footage from the rape case in Israel detention center that sparked a lot of controversy and also a lot of discussions in Israel as well. We'll have a conversation about that. And we'll be analyzing the appointment of Yahya Sinwar as Hamas's new political leader. I think it's a very important step. We want to discuss that and the impact of that on ceasefire discussions and the possible shape of a Iranian response to the killing of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar's predecessor. And then we'll end the conversation with an examination of Norway's diplomatic fallout with Israel and also Japan's decision to disinvite Israel from the Nagasaki commemoration ceremony. So there's a lot to get through, but let's begin, Moin, as I said, with the attack last week of more than 100 Palestinians, of a Palestinian school in Gaza, killing more than 100 Palestinians. Three of the bombs were weighed more than 2,000 pounds. They're the regular kind of bombs Israel has been using against the Palestinians in Gaza, which has now been bombed more than any time during the Second World War. Israel is falsely claiming that 19 of the 100 Palestinians that were killed are Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad members. What do we know about this strike? And in particular, I want to get your thoughts on how Israel appears to have created a new norm in war where you can simply say that there's an enemy combatant and that justifies any kind of attack that is launched against a civilian population or protected institution like a school, like a hospital, for example.
Yes, thank you for that question, Nassim. On the early morning of, I believe it was the 10th of August at approximately 5 a.m., the U.S. armed and supported Israeli military conducted an attack with three US-made and supplied missiles on a prayer room in the Al school in the Daraj quarter of Gaza City. Approximately 100 civilians were killed in that attack. And apparently, the situation was so apocalyptic that no bodies survived, just parts of bodies. And people have been telling horror stories about how they would weigh human remains. If they were under a certain weight, it would be a child. If it was over a certain weight, it would be an adult. And I think the context for this is that there has been a intensification of attacks by the US armed and supplied and supported Israeli military on schools where desperate Palestinian civilians have been seeking refuge from these mass bombings of the Gaza Strip. Um, Israel attempted to justify this attack that killed almost 100 Palestinian civilians, many of them engaged in the morning prayers, by claiming it was an attack on a joint Hamas Islamic Jihad military headquarters. And subsequently, they released the names of 19 Palestinian commanders and operatives who they claim were killed in that attack. And then yesterday, they said actually it was 38 Palestinian commanders and operatives. Strangely enough, including, for example, a commander from the central Gaza Strip. What he was doing in Gaza City wasn't explained. And of course, also claiming that the actual number of civilians killed was much fewer. Don't forget, this is the same government whose leader Benjamin Netanyahu, asserted before Congress that not a single Palestinian civilian has been killed in Israel's genocidal onslaught on Rafah, and received a rapturous standing ovation from the U.S. Political elite for making that statement. And I think, Israel's claims first of all, Israel's claims in this regard are effectively disproven. I would argue by definition disproven, given its systematic obfuscation and mendacity in such cases. But here they actually gave the names of people who they killed. It turned out that several of these individuals on its list have indeed been killed, but were killed previously in different locations. Um, People who are personally familiar with some of the names on this list have indicated that these are individuals who have absolutely no involvement with either Hamas or Islamic Jihad, or indeed any Palestinian political or military movement. And in one case, the individual was known to be engaged in a serious dispute with Hamas. But I think what we need to understand here is that Israel is not particularly concerned with proving its case. Its objective is to sow confusion rather than necessarily to convince its audience. It merely has to assert that this was an attack on a legitimate military target. And immediately, the mainstream Western media, which will not even tell us that it is unable to examine Israel's claims because Israel prevents them from reaching these areas, will immediately begin circulating these false assertions and circulating them as credible as credible claims until proven otherwise. So, in other words, the combination of Israel's claims and Western media complicity immediately transforms what is transparently an atrocity, a massacre of some 100 civilians, into a situation of he said, she said, in which people of good faith who may not be particularly familiar with the situation will have to conclude, well, one party says this, the other party says that. We really can't make up our minds, but perhaps they will give Israel the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps they will be generally skeptical of Israel. But the idea that this is one in a growing and intensifying series of atrocities against the Palestinian civilian population of the Gaza Strip gets buried under this deliberately manufactured fog. And then, of course, you have Israel saying, well, it wasn't a school in session and so on, as if the idea that you didn't have pupils in classrooms, but rather had hundreds, arguably thousands of desperate refugees seeking shelter, somehow deprives this location of immunity.
I mean, you mentioned the list and the names of those that were killed or were on the Israeli list. One of the names was Ahmed IAB Al Jabari. So there's a human rights organization called Euromed Human Rights Monitor, and they've been following this story quite closely and found that IAB was actually killed by Israel on December 5, 2023. So months before the attack. So it just shows that the entire list probably is just doctored. It's not really a true, authentic list.
Yes,
And one journalist from Gaza, I want to basically summarize what he said about the Israeli attack. He just said basically what Israel did was bomb a random Fajr prayer, the morning prayer, at an overcrowded school, assuming Hamas members are religious. So they'd probably be some of them among the worshippers. They claim to be targeting nameless senior commander. Then took 16 hours to come up with names, and they just come up with a name of individuals that have been killed months ago.
Yes, I mean, I don't want to get into a discussion of the laws of war because I think this should be transparently obvious to any sentient human being. But the fact that they would put forward names of people who were killed months before, and they must have the knowledge that it's not that difficult to expose this lie, shows how complacent Israel has become. Because it knows there will be no consequences and no repercussions. The only repercussion will be impunity. It knows that the US, which again arms, supplies, supports, and defends the Israeli military and its genocide, and is therefore, by this stage, directly complicit in this. It knows Washington has Israel's back. It knows there's an army of reputable news organizations that at the push of a button will begin circulating these Israeli assertions and Israeli claims and posters of dead Palestinian commanders and operatives who were supposedly killed in this strike. So, it cuts both ways. Their complacency leads them to produce easily exposed fabrications, but at the same time, their complacency derives from a justified confidence that they can do this time after time after time after time. Israel, is the state that can cry wolf morning, afternoon, and evening every day of the year, and the Western media will never question, and every time, will report that there is indeed a wolf. That's what we're dealing with here.
I think it's impunity that's also at the root of our next topic, which is a statement by outrageous comment by Israel's finance minister Bezalel Smotrich. But before I do that, I wanted to share a quote with our viewers by Hannah Arendt, who in 1955, this is nearly 70 years ago, said that the Israelis, treat the Arabs, Palestinians, those who are still here, in a way that in itself would be enough to rally the whole world against Israel. So that was in 1955. And she said if the world saw what was happening, they should rally against Israel. Of course, the world hasn't rallied against Israel. And if anything, we are seeing situation having escalated into a genocide. And I wanted to contrast that with what Smotrich said. He said it may be just and moral to starve 2 million Palestinians in Gaza until Israeli hostages are returned. But no one in the world would allow us to do that. I mean, at the heart of this is a culture where genocide and the dehumanization, genocidal talk is accepted, that the dehumanization of Palestinians is so deep rooted that people like Smotrich and other Israeli leaders can make comments like that. So I want you to get your thoughts on that, and also how since 70 years, when Aaron made that comment, that this culture of allowing Israel to just get away with things has been so deeply embedded and infected this whole situation.
Well, Hannah Arendt was in my view entirely correct, particularly her statement, "If the world saw," and in the time that she was writing these words, the world not only could not see or would not see, but what they should have seen was being very effectively concealed from their eyes and their ears by the Israeli government, the complicity of Western governments, and of course the services provided by the Western media to Israel. Now, Smotrich's problem is in part that he thinks he's still living in the world of Hannah Arendt, and he can say and do whatever he wants, and it will remain en famille. His other problem is that he can't help himself. He is so dedicated to this neo-fascist fanaticism that it seems this is a guy who can't go to bed at night unless he's made a genocidal statement and received confirmation that it has entered cyberspace. And I mean, look at a statement basically saying Israel can and should starve 2 million Palestinians to death, and that the only thing stopping it is the possibility of international repercussions. In other words, there are absolutely no limits or inhibitions or anything of that sort on Israel's actions. It's just that, unfortunately, from his point of view, it has to take account of the outside world. I would add that his concerns about the international or particularly Western response are most likely exaggerated. Um, but what do we get? Josep Borrell, the effectively the foreign minister of the European Union, condemns the statements. U.S. government spokesmen criticize them as if they are not marching in lockstep with this government, as if they are not standing shoulder to shoulder with Ben Gvir, with Smotrich, with Netanyahu in their genocidal war against the Palestinians. So, these gusts of hot air that we hear from Brussels, London, Washington, and elsewhere are absolutely meaningless. When you are actively participating in a genocide and you are arming and supplying and defending and supporting the army that is committing it, and you do no more than verbally condemn a statement here or a statement there, I think it magnifies your complicity rather than reduces it. And some people will kind of laugh this off as an irresponsible statement by a well-known extremist and so on. Well, this is a person who was Israel's finance minister. This is an individual who holds the continued existence of the current Israeli governing coalition in the palm of his hand. So to also try to minimize it, I think, is entirely reprehensible.
We've commented on that before, that the idea that this is somehow just a bunch of bad
Yeah.
apples, or Netanyahu and his current government of far right extremists. It's not so, and and that's not really the case. And you see that with the next topic, which I want to discuss, which is the rape case in the detention center. So now that's horrified everyone who saw the video. And it's been well documented. There's enough witness to say that it was institutionalized. On the back of that, there's been report by Bezalel, the Israeli human rights organization, who actually did say that there's institutionalized abuse taking place in Israeli detention centers. And the report they published was called "Welcome to Hell," and they said that that was just tip of the iceberg. And if anyone doubts that rape and sexual abuse is institutionalized in Israeli prisons, they should meet someone called Rabbi Colonel Eyal Karim. So he is the head of the military rabbinate of the Israeli Defense Force. And who is this person? So according to the Times of Israel, Rabbi Karim is of the opinion that rape in wartime is permitted. So when people are shocked, I think they're shocked because they don't realize to what extent, to what degree Israel has dehumanized Palestinians, and rape is, by senior officials, believe that rape against Palestinians is permitted. So I want to get your thoughts on that, especially on the back of comment you made, following the casual manner in which Israeli society speaks about rape. You said that on Twitter, upon further reflection, it's unfair to claim that Israel is the only place on earth where the pros and cons of rape are publicly discussed with the same seriousness and climate change or inflation in civilized countries. It was similar in the ISIS self-proclaimed caliphate. So I thought you we basically summed up the feeling and the sense in a nice way. So just expand on that tweet and comment on what I said about the fact that rape has become so normalized in Israeli. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. I think Israeli leaders justify that in ways which others would never think of doing so.
Well, I think it's important just to take a step back and recapitulate what we're dealing with. This month, we have had a series of pro-rape riots, pro-gang rape riots in Israel. And these pro-rape riots have been led by and included government ministers, members of parliament, leaders of prominent political parties. And secondly, we have witnessed a very serious national conversation in Israel, in its media, in its leading television stations, in its newspapers, about the pros and cons of rape. Kind of like, where in other countries, akin to a serious panel discussion on Newsnight or whatever about the pros and cons of solar energy. That's where we're at. This, Israel is now in the midst of a genuinely serious discussion about the pros and cons of rape. And it's not because some lunatic made a comment that has outraged society. No, society is divided about whether rape is a good or a bad thing. And both perspectives are considered equally legitimate in this debate. That's why advocates of systematic rape are being invited onto these shows and politely given the space to explain their reasoning. And then, they're not ridiculed and condemned and denounced, but they're part of a genuinely serious conversation. That's where we're at. That's where we're at. Of course, you'll never see any of this on Memory or all the other outfits that specialize in propaganda about these issues. But that is where we're at. A serious national discussion about the pros and cons of rape. Now, um, it boggles the mind, but that's where we're at. And on that basis, I think the comparison that I drew with ISIS and its elevation of rape as almost a religious obligation, I think was entirely appropriate and legitimate. Not only that, it's being borne out by reality. This Iyal Karim that you talked about, he's a fringe rabbi or was a fringe rabbi who was making the argument that rape is permitted during wartime. Well, how did the Israeli military respond to this guy? It appointed him chief rabbi of the Israeli military. That is where we're at. It's completely off the rails. But once again, we're not talking about a rogue state such as perhaps Myanmar. No, we're talking about a state that is at the very heart of the Western alliance, whose military is armed and supplied by the United States, the United Kingdom, and European countries, and whose impunity is considered a central defining principle of their rules-based international order.
Let's turn our attention to the next big story, which is the selection of Yahya Sinwar as the political leader of Hamas. So many thought after the killing of or assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, someone like Khalid Mash'al would return. That's not been the case. So I just want to get your thoughts on Sinwar's appointment. Is this a signal towards a more hardline approach? What do you think?
Well, I should preface my remarks by saying that, like many people, I was surprised by the choice of Sinwar. But having said that, I think it is more of symbolic than substantive significance. I was not expecting Khalid Mash'al to be reappointed as a head of the Hamas Politburo. He had already served 2 terms, and he had been the head of the organization during the rupture with Iran, so it was unlikely it would be him. I thought it might be someone like Khalil al-Hayya or perhaps Azat Rishik. But what we saw was that Hamas unanimously, according to his statement, selected Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, as the overall head of the movement by appointing him head of the Politburo. Um, in terms of its political impact, I think we need to understand that even during the years that Ismail Haniyeh was ahead of the Hamas Politburo, Yahya Sinwar, despite being subordinate to Haniyeh, let's say in Hamas's organigram, was already the most powerful and consequential leader in the Gaza Strip. He may have only been the leader of Hamas. He may have only been the movement's leader in the Gaza Strip, but the Gaza Strip is also the only territory where Hamas rules, and it's where its military assets are at their strongest. More recently, he was also closely involved in decision making within the movement, particularly with respect to negotiations about a ceasefire and an exchange of captives and so on. And it was broadly understood that Hamas would not be able to accept or reject anything unless he was on board with that decision. And so there's that. I think it will have, I would point to its symbolic significance, if you will, in the following way. Israel essentially decided to take out the chief negotiator of Hamas when it assassinated Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, um, perhaps thinking that this would put more pressure on the movement to accede to Israeli demands in these negotiations. Well, Hamas has responded by saying, okay, you don't want to deal with someone who was broadly seen as pragmatic, as eager to push for a deal, who was cooperating closely with the Qataris and Egyptians. You don't want to deal with that person, so you went out of your way to kill him. Well, now you're going to deal with the architect of the 7 October attacks, so, and someone who you were supposed to have already killed almost a year ago. You're now negotiating with the movement that you said you would never negotiate with because you were going to achieve total victory. And your counterpart now is the person who you hold chiefly responsible for the 7th of October. So have fun, guys. This is a consequence of your actions. The other possible impact that it has is, as you may be familiar, Israel and the United States and some of their European allies have constantly been calling upon Qatar to put pressure on Hamas leaders who live in Qatar at the time, Hania, Mash'al, and others, by threatening them with expulsion if they would not capitulate to U.S.-Israeli demands in the ceasefire negotiations. Well, that's no longer really on the cards because you can't exactly threaten Yahya Sinwar, who was in the Gaza Strip, with expulsion from Qatar.
On your second point, I think was that really on the cards, though, in the sense that in every single negotiation, Hamas was the one who seemed to be wanting a ceasefire in exchange for hostages, but a permanent ceasefire, and that's the same thing it's insisting on now. What Hamas is doing, well, under Yahya Sinwar, they are demanding from the mediators a plan to implement what was accepted by Hamas in 2nd July, according to Biden's vision. So in terms of ceasefire, where do you see that going? Hamas has basically made that demand that we will not negotiate any further until Israel abides by the plan that was already agreed to. So is that really Sinwar's shift, or do you think even someone like Ismail Haniyeh, if he was alive, would have insisted on Israel fulfilling the obligations according to the 2nd July Biden vision for a ceasefire?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that within Hamas, the capacity for its leader to act unilaterally, particularly where that leader's inclinations essentially would ride roughshod over the collective consensus of other leadership members is very limited. This is a situation very different from what we have, for example, in the Palestinian Authority, where Abu Mazen is in complete and supreme control and can effectively take any decision he wants, and either no one will challenge him on it, or he's in a position where he can just ignore any challenge and opposition to his decisions. Within Hamas, the situation is quite different. So when we look at any decision that movement takes, whether it is to participate or not participate in negotiations, I would be a little wary about assigning that decision to just a single individual, no matter how prominent or powerful they may be. Now, to get back to your question, last week or several days ago, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, by way of a statement signed by the heads of state of all three countries, basically indicated it's time to wrap this up. It's time to actually agree and implement a ceasefire proposal, and then invited the parties to resume discussions this Thursday, the 15th of August. I mean, one might question why, if the need is for an immediate ceasefire, the discussions were scheduled to start a week later. But that aside, Hamas responded to this invitation by saying it didn't see any need to send a delegation to Cairo to engage in negotiations, because a further negotiating process, much like Oslo during the 1990s, at this stage would only serve as cover for the US and Israel to continue with their genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip. And the position of Hamas is, the US has already made a ceasefire proposal, a ceasefire initiative that, according to President Biden, was formulated by none other than Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Hamas then says it has already accepted that initiative, and it accepted it on the 2nd of July. So rather than engage in negotiations about an initiative, since that initiative already exists, that it's calling upon the mediators, or the United States and the Egyptian Qatari mediators, to present an implementation plan for an initiative that has already been proposed, that Israel has already formulated, and that Hamas has already accepted. So that's the position of Hamas. Having said that, I find it extremely unlikely that Hamas would refuse any informal consultations with the Egyptians or with the Qataris. And at the same time, the Israelis are claiming that this is just a Hamas tactic because they weren't supposed to participate in these discussions anyway. Who knows? But the point is that Hamas is seeking to put the spotlight on the Americans of stop messing around. You proposed an initiative. You said the onus was on us to accept it because it had in fact been written by Netanyahu. Well, we've already accepted it. Put some meat on these bones and we'll talk.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, the reason Israel will now have to negotiate with the person who they hold to be responsible for the 7 October attack is because of the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. And since then, there's been a lot of talk about the shape and form of an Iranian response. Iranian response seems inevitable. There's been a lot of talks about that over the past week. Do you think it'll be another one of those coordinated response that causes little to no damage, as we saw several months ago, or does Iran this time, or axis of resistance, as it's called, will they be, or will they? Do they think they'll have to demonstrate a kind of response which at least shows that Iran has some muscle behind it and it can cause damage, and there are consequences for Israel if it carries out assassination attacks and undermines Iranian sovereignty? Because I don't think that was a message Iranians understood from the what Iranians delivered from its first attack a few months ago. It was so coordinated. I don't think people felt that, is that really the best Iran can do? Does Iran need to do more than it did a few months ago?
Well, Iran has indicated that that's its own view. In other words, that in contrast to April, it is not going to respond to Israel with a largely symbolic attack whose purpose was primarily to send a political message rather than to inflict strategic damage on Israel. How will Iran respond? Will Iran respond? I think at this stage it's a matter of pure speculation. Will Iran respond by directly attacking Israel? That's entirely possible, but I would also point out that there are now growing voices within Iran saying that Israel's assassination of Haniya in the heart of Tehran at a guest facility that was operated by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps changes the strategic equation to the extent that Iran should now develop a nuclear weapon. So perhaps its response will not be directed directly at Israel, but rather have something to do with Iranian nuclear program. I really have no idea. The other question, of course, is that Hezbollah has also vowed to hit back at Israel strategically. And will these, if you include with them the Houthis in Yemen and so on, will the response be coordinated, sequential, separate? I really have no idea, and I don't think anyone else does either. The only observation I would make is that we're now in a position where if Iran and Hezbollah and the others, I think that what they intend to do is to respond to Israel in a way that does not necessarily require Israel to engage in very significant escalation in its own response and leave Israel in a dilemma. If Israel does not respond, it will look weak and deterred. And if Israel does respond, it will be Israel that bears responsibility for the consequences. And what I think that they intend to do here is basically place Israel in a corner, but in doing so, we may now be on the cusp of a new reality where what these other parties do is no longer organically related to what happens in the Gaza Strip. The Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah has said as much, that even if the war in Gaza ends tomorrow morning, Hezbollah still intends to launch a reprisal for the assassination of Fuad Shukr in Beirut. In other words, this was always implicit from the very beginning that the longer Washington waited to call off its Israeli proxy, the greater the risk of not only a full-scale conflagration in the Middle East, but one that could no longer be brought to an end by ending Israel's genocidal campaign against the Palestinians. That's where we are now. There's also, getting back to your previous question, there's also talk that the reason Washington is now calling for these meetings and so on is basically to throw a bone to the Iranians in the sense that, well, you don't need to respond, or at least if you do respond, you don't need to respond powerfully because we are in the process of arranging a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. I suspect from Tehran and Beirut, this has as much credibility as any U.S. statement in the 1990s of stick with the Oslo process and you'll get your Palestinian state.
Let's end this week's conversation on two global issues related to Israel. First is the decision by Israel to revoke diplomatic status of 8 Norwegian diplomats. Israel, surprise, surprise, chose to punish the Palestinians for that by obstructing the tax which Palestinians are due. And the other one is a decision by the mayor of Hiroshima to disinvite Israel from the yearly Nagasaki commemoration ceremony. So to me, I mean, that's a big deal. I mean, Japan is not some member of the Axis of Resistance. Japan is lock, step, and barrel, has always been on the side of the US since Second World War. It rarely disobeys Washington. So just talk about those two developments. It seems like Israel is becoming more and more isolated beyond its core supporters being US, UK, Germany, France, and a few others. But if Japan is willing to disinvite, and Norway is taking steps to recognize Palestine, even though suffering the consequences it did by having 8 of his diplomats being denied diplomatic status. There's a shift taking place, don't you think?
Well, let's start with Nagasaki. If I'm not mistaken, the mayor of Nagasaki did not disinvite the Israeli ambassador from the commemorations of the atomic bombing of his city. Rather, he chose not to invite the Israeli ambassador to that event. Now, the formal reason given by the mayor of Nagasaki is that he wanted to avoid a potential situation of chaos and disorder at such a somber event, alluding to the possibility that there would be demonstrations against a decision by the municipality of Nagasaki to invite a representative of the genocidal regime to what is supposed to be a somber commemoration of the incineration of tens of thousands of people by a nuclear weapon. That's the official reason, and it may well be the correct one. Alternatively, it could be that the sentiment in Nagasaki's halls of power was that it was simply inappropriate to invite a representative of a regime that is currently engaged in an intensified genocide to participate on such an occasion. What of course raised eyebrows, and I don't think it should have really surprised us all that much, was we saw the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and others withdraw their own ambassadors from participation in this event. In other words, and it's particularly, I think, ironic in the case of the United States. I mean, Washington is basically telling Nagasaki, unless you have the ambassador of a genocidal regime present at this commemoration, we will not participate at the expected level in the commemoration of our incineration of tens of thousands of your citizens and residents. Israel über alles is really the only way to put it. Now, in terms of Norway, that's a very different situation. We've spoken, I think it was a few months ago, about the whole issue with Palestinian Authority tax revenues and how Israel, in the person of Finance Minister Smotrich, who we discussed a few moments ago, was seeking by hook or by crook to avoid transferring Palestinian tax receipts to the Palestinian Authority. And now he's found his way to do it once again. An agreement was reached at the time to transfer the Palestinian tax receipts to the Palestinian Authority by way of Norway, with the agreement of Israel and the United States. I was always skeptical this arrangement was going to last because it's quite clear that Israel, Netanyahu, and particularly Smotrich and Ben Gvir want to bring down the Palestinian Authority. I mean, they don't even want a Palestinian Quisling. They want nothing that is Palestinian. And now they have found their way to do so. They have removed the accreditation of, I believe, 8 Norwegian diplomats who are responsible for Norwegian relations with the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinians, and they have renounced this agreement, which, in my view, Norway should have never accepted to be involved with to begin with.
That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, joining me for our weekly review show with me, Nassim Ahmed. Thank you, Mouin. As always,
Thank you very much, Nassim.
Thank you, and see you all next week. Tune in for another weekly review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and Mouin Rabbani. Bye-bye.